here's a neural model. As we take a look at these little parts of the neuron, let's get oriented first. Over here on this side would be the body, as well as we come down, this would be the distal portion or the axon. So let's begin to focus on some of the structures that we can see here on the body. Well, first things first, we can kind of just say that that whole thing is the body, or also known as the soma. Soma means body, or also known as the perikaryon. So the perikaryon, people have defined it as, oh, that's the area around the nucleus, which would be the body. So that's why we call it that. So it could be the perikaryon or the soma. Most people call it the soma. If I were to lift this off, they're just trying to illustrate that, yes, it's three-dimensional, but if I were to cut this off, you can see that it looks very similar to a normal cell. You got the nucleus, you got all these endoplasmic reticulum with the Golgi body kind of here hanging out, and then all these little red dots, those are all the ribosomes, making all our wonderful proteins. So let's kind of get a couple things under our belt before we move on. If we broke out the neuron into four major parts, you can divide them into the things that come off the body, which are called dendrites, the body itself, the soma, or perikaryon, the axon that goes all the way down, and then the part that we actually don't see is when the axon then splits off into its axonal terminals or synaptic terminals or boutons, things like that, whatever you want to call it. But that part is not on this model. We have these three: dendrites, soma, and then the axon. All right, let's take a look at some of the other additional structures that connect this. If a neuron is in space, it is useless. I mean, neurons are made to carry information, and it's just like saying if I have like a video cable or a computer cable and it's just sitting on my desk, it doesn't connect to a computer, it doesn't connect to a TV, it doesn't connect to anything, it's useless. So any kind of neuron has to be connected to something else, whether it's a muscle, whether it's the brain, or something it has to be connected. And here is demonstrated with plenty of other connections. So you can kind of see these other little things that hang off, and touching these dendrites are from other neurons, making connections, passing information. So these are our axonal terminals or synaptic terminals, and then in between would be our synapse. Synapse is just space between the cells. All right, let's get to the nitty-gritty of the anatomy here. So if we already got the dendrites, the soma, the axon, well, what else can we see? We can see the nucleus, the Golgi body, and then this rough endoplasmic reticulum. These are called nissl bodies. When somebody kind of looked at it, they saw, wow, there's so many kind of ribosomes hanging out from there. Well, that person was Mr. Nissl, and he says, they're my bodies, so I would call them nissl bodies. I don't know if he had an accent or not, but regardless, that is nissl bodies, like the stuff that you can kind of see on a microscope. They look like that. They're the ribosomes with the endoplasmic reticulum kind of hanging out from there. So in addition to that, all these dendrites come together in the soma, and then there's only one axon coming out. So this part right here, you can kind of see it cut away, leading into this very, very long axon. This would be considered this triangle portion called the axon hillock, or the beginning of the axon. Beginning of the axon is the axon hillock, most sensitive part of the neuron. Specifically, when we say sensitives, it just has the most channels, so that things can be stimulated there, and voila, you can stimulate the action potential all the way down. From there, you can kind of see the axon coming down, with the axonal fibrils coming through there. So, but if you notice, this is not just the axon. There's some cells that surround the axon with its cell membrane. Well, these types of cells, their name is called neurolemmacytes. A lot of people call them now Schwann cells because Mr. Schwann actually discovered them, and from there he called them Schwann cells. So Schwann cells is a lot easier to say than neurolemmacytes, but regardless, that is what they are, neurolemmacytes, and they create what we call a myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is all these little, if you can kind of see all these little kind of ridges and all these extra amounts of cell membranes, like so many of them. This is the myelin sheath. And some people can get confused. You know, when I point to this, is it a cell? Is it the myelin sheath? Well, I make this analogy. If you know of a character that wraps his arms around somebody, that just kind of wraps and wraps and wraps and wraps, I could point to this and say, what is this covering? And you would look at it and you'd be like, well, if it's a person, well, that's his arms. And then I say, well, who is that? Well, then you would say, well, that's that person's name. So in the same sense, if I pointed this, what's this covering, all these little layers, you would say that's the myelin sheath. But if I said, what cell is that? You would say, oh, that's a Schwann cell. Mr. Schwann cell, hello. So that is the difference between the myelin sheath, which is actually the layers of the plasma membrane of the myelin sheath. You can't separate them. Just like if I said, oh, So are you talking about his arms or him? They're the same thing. I can't separate them because they're attached and they're part of each other. And that's what we find here. This is a Schwann cell with the myelin sheath on it. And then as it comes over, you can kind of see Schwann cells are kind of short so that they have these little gaps. This is what we call the node Ranvier. It's French, Mr. Ranvier. Kind of found these where there's gaps in between. And you'll also find they're also called neurofibril gaps or neurofibril nodes. So these are the nodes of Ranvier. And then lastly is this connective tissue covering, and this should extend all the way, but they kind of cut it off the rest. This is called the endoneurium. Connective tissue, it sounds a lot like endomysium if you think of muscles, but this is endoneurium, connective tissue sheath to give it some strength and stuff like that for the actual axon. So let's review really quickly. So this is our neuron. We have 4 major parts to it, and the parts of the neuron itself is the dendrites, the soma or perikaryon, and then the axon, and then the axonal terminals, which you can kind of see here from this other side. From there, you can see the perikaryon also has these nissl bodies, as all these, ribosomal endoplasmic reticulum. When it blends into the axon, this is the axon hillock, and then the axon is surrounded by a myelin sheath, which is the cell membrane of a cell called the Schwann cell, and then you have multiple of them, so you have gaps in between called the nodes of Ranvier or neurofibril nodes, and then you have a connective tissue covering called the endoneurium.